and for being here to you show for this exciting paper. Right. And there is no conference about crisis without water on your papers, I guess. Right. So, in my paper today, I wish to reflect on the concept of crisis in Jewish modernity through two terms that I already mentioned in my opening remarks, which are Messianism and interpretation. The crisis of Messianism is clearly described by Shenhav in his seminal essay from 1959, The Messianic Idea in Judaism. Shenhav devotes the last segment of his text to a matter that received too little attention to his opinion, namely the price of Messianism. And Shenhav argues that the constant hope for Messianic redemption led the Jewish people into a state of endlessness, powerlessness, preventing them for centuries from playing an active role in world history. Shenhav asserts that in Judaism, and I'm quoting here, you have some of it in your handout before you, in Judaism, the Messianic idea has compelled a life of deferment in which nothing can be done definitively. Nothing can be irrevocably accomplished. Precisely understood, there is nothing concrete which can be accomplished by the undoing. End of quote. So, Shenhav describes a profound state of messianic crisis that defines the life and endangers the future of the Jewish people. Nevertheless, I wish to do an heretical act and ask today if Shenhav is necessarily right, or maybe this messianic crisis can serve not only as a danger, but also as a catalyst for human activity. And even if the linguistic coin, the price of messianism, was not widely used before Shenhav's essay, the core question asked by him is mirrored in a long and ongoing discussion on the question of messianism and human agency. It is a question about the inherent crisis encapsulated in the messianic idea, about the manners in which the messianic hope or process can lead not only to the crisis of deferment and passivity, but to concrete moral, religious, and political deeds. Now, the absolute majority of Jewish sources are addressing the question of messianism, that address the question of messianism, toward humans' different forms of agency. However, the nature of the human activity corresponding with the messianic process stands in question. On the one hand, the messianic agency can be focused on the political communal level, namely the redemptive process contains a form of gathering the Jewish people from their diasporas, achieving some kind of political goal. Nevertheless, the notion of messianic agency can be invested also in the ethical religious sphere. Supposedly, redemption can be guaranteed through my own ethical actions in the world. Now, a prominent traditional text that invites discussions on the question of redemption and agency is the Talmudic tale about the Messiah at the gates of Rome. And I will offer a brief summary of the tale, but we have it in front of you, also in the Aramaic and in the English. So in Tractate Sanhedrin, Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi meets the Messiah at the gates of Rome. So Yoshua ben Levi meets the Messiah at the gates of Rome, where he sits wounded among the poor and the lepers. Ben Levi asks the Messiah about the date of his arrival, and the Redeemer surprisingly answers him, "Today, I'm coming today." However, as redemption fails to arrive, Ben Levi complains to the prophet Elijah and argues that his Messiah is a liar. At this point, Elijah deciphers the messianic message and explains the true meaning of the Redeemer's words. "Today, if you will listen to my voice." A passage from Psalm 95:7. The tale brings up the tangible possibility that the Messiah might redeem the world in any given day. Moreover, it clarifies through the words of Elijah that for the Messiah to fulfill his vocation, the people should follow the Messiah's or God's voice. In other words, people have the agency to act in the world in a manner that would lead into an immediate redemption. But the correct nature of these redemptive actions are missing from the tale. The tale embodies a profound state of crisis. The world can radically change at any given day, but the dramatic event is postponed time and time again, day after day, as the road to redemption is open for interpretation. However, actually it's not the tale alone that raises the matter of the Messianic crisis and the question of agency, but maybe primarily its various interpretations. Whenever one tries to decipher the Messianic message and revisits the encounter between Levi and the Redeemer, the experience of crisis and the question of agency receives new meanings. In the framework of this paper, I wish to shed light on part of the unique and under-researched reception story of the tale in the 20th century. In what follows, I will discuss three modern interpretations to the Talmudic Messianic tale by Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig, and Jacques Derrida. And in my comparative reading of these three interpretations, I will argue that Buber, Rosenzweig, and Derrida offer very different takes on the tale. However, all of them do see in the Aggadic text and in its Messianic structure, and in the Messianic structure in general, a catalyst for human activity and agency of different kinds. And I should say that this is a part of a larger project in its early stages about the role of the Talmud in general and the Talmud Haggadah in particular in modern Jewish political thought. Okay, so this was a more general introduction, but now it should be more fun because we're gonna just read with you a few interpretations to the statement, and we'll do kind of a Talmudic or Midrashic exercise and see how these thinkers are reinventing and retelling this Talmudic story. So, okay, so it's going to be less heavy, hopefully. So, in the 16th of January 1909, Martin Buber presents before the Zionist Park office in Prague the first of his three addresses on Judaism, and concludes his speech with a dramatic reference to the tale about the Messiah, the Gates of Rome. And I'm reading him in the English translation. When I was a child, I read an old Jewish tale I could not understand. It said no more than this: outside the gates of Rome, there sits a leprous beggar, waiting. He is the Messiah. Then I came upon an old man whom I asked, what is he waiting for? And the old man gave me an answer I did not understand at the time. An answer I learned to understand only much later. He said, he waits for you. So that's all. I argue that Buber's interpretation engages with two interconnected forms of crisis, the one of Messianism and agency, and the other of Jewish identity at the beginning of the 20th century. My assumption is that if the tale might be read as a text that encapsulates a certain form of passivity and deferment, then Buber changes its content and charges it with an urgency for Jewish communal and political action. A comparative examination of Buber's version next to the Haggadah from Tractate Sanhedrin reveals a creative, radical, and very selective hermeneutical process. What immediately sticks out in Buber's decision to tell the story Buber is telling the story without its origin. It doesn't say anything about it's coming from the Talmud. Although when he gives this paper before the students club of Bar Kochba, we know that many of the participants know this tale by heart. I mean, it's the canon of Jewish Midrashic literature. So there is a lot of irony in this gesture. So Buber defines the Haggadah as an old Jewish tale that he heard as a child. Moreover, Buber completely disregards the climatic moment in which Levi actually meets the Messiah and asks him about the date of his arrival, and we receive the answer today. And Buber refrains from adhering to the notion of deferment encapsulated in this Messianic today, is postponed from one day to the next. So, in a way, the profound crisis of deferment is just omitted by Buber, right? So Buber's version of the Talmudic tale includes two parts. One he read supposedly in scriptures, and the other was supposedly delivered to him orally. Buber first explains that the tale states nothing but, outside the gates of Rome, there sits a leprous beggar waiting. He is the Messiah. Afterwards, Buber describes how as a child he asked for clarifications from an old man who revealed to him that the Messiah waits for you. However, the so-called, let's say, authentic conversation between the child and the old man is actually a sophisticated and quite funny take on the Talmudic text. Tractate Sanhedrin describes how, after the meeting with the Messiah, Levi returns to Elijah, who explains that what the Redeemer actually means by saying today is today if you would listen to my voice. So in his speech, Buber puts himself in the position of Levi. And the old man who who declares that the Messiah waits for you, is substituting for Elijah. Now, it could be sensed as an act of secularization, but actually it isn't. It corresponds with the many stories of Gilad Eliyahu, in which Elijah the prophet wears different costumes. So, in a way, Buber positions himself in the place of someone who's speaking with Elijah the prophet. But Elijah gives a different message than in the Talmudic tale, right? So, Buber's version to the tale emphasizes the values of Jewish activity and importance. Two elements that play a prominent role in his notion of Jewish renewal that is promoted in the addresses of Judaism. In his first speech, Buber calls for a process of self-affirmation that should potentially redeem the modern Jew from her crisis of torn existence. He describes how the modern Jew feels principally divided. On the one hand, the Jew belongs to a local community with which she shares a language, social codes, surroundings, and more. However, on the other hand, the Jewish subject belongs to a broader group defined by Buber as a community of blood that goes beyond time and place and includes all past and future Jews. Buber asserts that, and here I'm quoting, when we, the Jews, have said yes to ourselves and to the whole of and to our whole Jewish existence, then our feelings will no longer be the feelings of individuals. Every individual among us will feel that he is the people, for he will feel the people within himself. End of quote. Buber's reference to the Talmudic text and the inversion of its meaning from passive to active terms stands in accordance with the notion of self-affirmation when the Messianic call for action, he waits for you, can be seen as equivalent to Buber's demand for saying yes to the wholeness of Jewish existence. In other words, even though one cannot anticipate the moment of Jewish renewal or the full self-affirmation of the Jewish people, one can actively prepare himself for it. Or as Buber puts it in his lecture, to be prepared does not mean to wait immovably. End of quote. And the active preparation for renewal is tantamount to answering the Messianic call. The Messianic crisis, the crisis of Jewish identity, can be gradually resolved by acting in the name of the Jewish collective. So my discussion thus far showed how Buber's attempt to resolve the crisis of Jewish identity is mirrored in his retelling of the Talmudic story and with the inversion of passive values into notions of activity and potency. The call for Jewish activeness is part of Buber's nuanced Zionist vision reflected in the addresses of Judaism. Buber's Zionist approach calls, on the one hand, for activity establishing a community of fellow Jews who are responsible for each other, but on the other hand, in the early 1920s, the beginning of the 20th century, Buber's approach does not yet engage with the concrete political means or practical formation of such a community in a designated territory. This comes only afterwards. So, Buber's version of the tale was popularized by a series of Jewish thinkers and authors like Arnold Zweig, Chaim Arlozorov, and Ernst Simon, who adhered to it in order to emphasize the necessity of performing political agency in order to overcome the crisis of identity. So I won't get into these following interpretations, but it's quite remarkable. People are quoting Buber time and time again when they themselves know for sure that Buber's version of the tale is not the original, right? And there's a chain of reception that engages with the Talmudic Agadah without quoting the Talmudic Agadah. So Buber receives a certain place of an origin. Right? So differently from Buber and his disciples, Franz Rosenzweig reads the tale as a text about crisis and agency of a different kind. In a letter to Gertrude Oppenheim from February 1917, Rosenzweig describes to his cousin the Messianic tale and, contrary to Buber, adheres to the original text with relatively minor modifications, and puts his emphasis on the notion of the Messianic today. And I'm quoting from my translation from the German. This is what he writes to Oppenheim. Zionism, if and to the extent it is exuberant, insane, consciously impossible, is a people, but much more than a people. The people's will belongs to this today. One cannot doubt it, because one is not allowed to. It is wholly like any madness. So this is how Rosenzweig perceived the Zionist understanding of the tale. Rosenzweig asserts that Zionists like Buber fail to acknowledge that the Messianic today is not a form of present to which they belong, but an anticipation to what can happen at any given day. Rosenzweig accuses Zion's Leitgruber for understanding the tale literally and finding it in its signs and instructions for their contingent political Messianic ideology. According to Rosenzweig, the Messianic experience of crisis is not one that can be answered by concrete political means. In his Star of Redemption, Rosenzweig presents a similar line of critique, but uses more general terminology. And I'm quoting in short, Rosenzweig says, the zealot or the sectarian, instead of accelerating the coming of the kingdom, sooner delays it. Time and hour are all the more powerful the less men looms them. This is what Rosenzweig says. And end of quote. Now, the insane Zionists described by Rosenzweig in his interpretation of the Talmudic tale seems to have similar characters as the zealot or the sectarian, who refuses to accept that the eternal realm is something both outside of history and beyond the linear perception of time. The eternal Messianic realm receives its allure in Rosenzweig's theological scheme from the very fact that it should not be concretized or anticipated in advance. Now, I'm wrongfully treating Rosenzweig in this paper, and it should be said that his views on Zionism are much more complex, and also in reference to this tale. And there is some kind of a shift in his interpretation of the tale in the 1920s, but we can speak about it in the Q&A, but for the matter of this specific argument, it's not critical. Okay, so his letter to Oppenheim, Rosenzweig not only criticizes Zionism, but also adheres to the tale in order to offer a counter-narrative to the concretization of the Messianic today. And I'm quoting, the equation between today, which only wants to be the bridge to tomorrow, and the other, today, which is the springboard to eternity, explains everything that seems to be contradictory to us. It is not written on the forehead of any day. If it is this or that today, one can never know. So no minor importance. They divide our life in time. End of quote. So according to Rosenzweig's interpretation, the arrival of the Messiah is tantamount to the commencement of eternity. The coupling of Messianism with eternity allows Rosenzweig to treat the Talmudic tale as a text about both manifesting and reconciling the tension between linear temporality and the notion of eternity. The first process progresses from today to tomorrow, while the second represents an absolute fulfillment that might commence at any given day. Rosenzweig perceived the two forms of today, the eternal and the contingent, as complementary to each other. In his interpretation of the Talmudic tale, he asserts, and I'm quoting, Israel has to make its way from today to tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, so that it will always has a today from which it can evoke the today of that legend, if it decides to. End of quote. Rosenzweig insists throughout his writings that the eternity is not foreign to the Jewish people, who can engage with it through the continuation of the Jewish lineage, blood community, and through various communal and religious practices and rituals. According to Rosenzweig, the Messianic today is not something one can concretize or towards which one can progress, but it is a notion that demands an active engagement and maintenance. In other words, the state of Messianic crisis is not something that one can simply resolve, but need to maintain the crisis. In his letter to Oppenheim, Rosenzweig emphasizes the ethical work that is required in order to maintain the validity of the Messianic today. He explains that the infinite, and I'm quoting here, the infinite is not very far away, but indeterminably far away. That means I do not know if it will actually take place in the next moment or at any other positioning instead. End of quote. I said that Rosenzweig's direct interpretation to the tale, as well as his implicit reference to the Talmudic text throughout the Star of Redemption, demonstrate why the indeterminable Messianic today must lead to human activity. And Rosenzweig writes, and I'm quoting again, the deed has its law and its content and at the infinite. To do good means to act unconditionally. Every deed should be done as if the fate of eternity depends on it, because one can never know if it does not depend on it. End of quote. So according to Rosenzweig, the content of the deed that would allow mankind to enter eternity is indeterminate. This leads him to conclusions. First, that good deeds should not be conducted according to a specific recipe, which would lead eventually to redemption. And secondly, exactly because there are no predefined instructions for bringing the Messiah, every deed can potentially lead to the anticipated redemption, and thus entails the greatest consequences. The performance of good deeds embodies a form of active anticipation to the Messianic redemption. In other words, the Messianic crisis and its indeterminable resolution serve as a catalyst to our moral agency in the world. Okay, so even though Bubel and Rosenzweig offer very different accounts of the tale, thereby on the Messianic crisis, they both see the Redeemer as their ally, and redemption is something desired. Now, at the final part of this paper, I wish to present Jacques Derrida's reading of the Haggadah that presents a different Messianic desire. Derrida embraces the experience of crisis, but objects to its resolution through the arrival of the Redeemer. For him, redemption should not come, and Messianic crisis should remain with us. So before diving into Derrida's interpretation, I will just say a few brief moments about a few brief words about his perception of Messianism. So Derrida's approach towards the notion of Messianism says on the following, that on the one hand, he wishes to adopt the Messianic spirit, but on the other hand, he refuses to commit to the content and history of the concrete Messianic narratives. Derrida is interested in adopting the temporality, urgency, and openness of the Messianic spirit. A spirit that instructs us to act in the present for the sake of the completely open future to come. Derrida chooses to treat the Messianic idea as a general structure of experience, generating constant alertness to what cannot be anticipated in advance. The Messianic structure of experience constantly reminds us that the truths we believe in and the interpretations we adopt are not absolute or fully stable, and thus can be undermined by the unpredictable singular event that might occur at any time. The singular event does not have a predetermined value or outcome, therefore we should be prepared for the best and the worst. So I would just say that in Derrida's term, there are many singular events, but there is no final singular event which ends the sequence of events in time. COVID-19 is an event, the fall of the Twin Towers is an event, but none of these events brings us into a standstill afterwards. We still need to be alert. So Derrida's Messianic structure embraces a certain notion of crisis. It is the fact that the radical event is always unknown and around the corner that fuels our actions in the world. Now, to stress the openness and the indeterminate nature of the Messianic future, Derrida adheres to what he calls elsewhere a universal form of Messianism, lacking any concrete content and thus irreducible to a specific promise or event. Particular eschatological narratives cannot be accommodated by the profound features of the Derridian Messianic scheme, because, and I'm quoting you from Derrida, as soon as you reduce the Messianic structure to Messianism, then you are reducing the universality. End of quote. Now, every particular form of Messianism includes specific content and a certain projection towards the future, and thereby it excludes other possibilities. So according to this logic, the only thing that is worse than the Messianic process, and Derrida says it explicitly, is the Messianic revelation itself. This is the worst for him. If God or the Messiah as his agent appear in the world, there is no more room for crisis. Everything is stabilized, and there is no anticipation for the future to come. And when you think about Derrida's project of deconstruction, there is no deconstruction if the Messiah enters this room of Haifa, right? Because what he says is the stability of meaning. And you cannot undermine the Messiah. He's the boss. So I assert that Derrida's stance on the Messianic idea and crisis is encapsulated in his interpretation to the Haggadah about the Messiah in Rome. And in a round table at Villanova University, Derrida interprets the tale in the following way. And it's quite a long quote, but I think it's worth it because it has a certain humor in it. So Derrida starts. Maurice Blanchot tells the story, which is already strange. This is not Maurice Blanchot. The Messiah was at the gates of Rome, unrecognized, dressed in rags. But one man who recognized that this was the Messiah went up to him and asked him, when will you come? I think this is very profound. It means that there is some inadequation between the now and now. He's coming now. The Messianic does not wait. This is a way of waiting for the future, right now. There is the possibility that my relation to the Messiah is this. I would like him to come. I hope that he will come, that the other will come, as other, for that would be justice, peace, and revolution. Because in the concept of Messianicity, there is revolution. And at the same time, I'm serious. I do not want what I want. And I would like the coming of the Messiah to be definitely postponed. And there is this desire in me that is why the man who addressed the Messiah said, "When will you come?" That is a way to say, well, as long as I speak to you, as long as I ask you the question, when will you come, at least you are not coming. And that is the condition for me to go on asking questions and living. So there is some ambiguity in the Messianic structure. We wait for something we would not like to wait for. That is another name for death. End of quote. So Derrida's choice to address Blanchot and not some more traditional versions of the tale is not accidental. And accords with his principal decision to distance himself from Messianic particularity. And I'm discussing it elsewhere, but there are good textual evidences that Derrida knows what he's doing, and that he read the tale, at least in its versions by Levinas and Scholem, but he decides very intentionally to walk through Blanchot in order to make his argument. So, the Talmudic parable is based on a specific religious framework and anticipates a concrete divine revelation. And reading the passage through Blanchot enables Derrida to avoid some of the religious gravitas of the Messianic tale. It is suddenly just a story told by a philosopher and picked up by another philosopher. The new status of the Messianic text as a story told by a non-Jewish philosopher expands Derrida's freedom and agency as an interpreter. Now, Derrida's Messianic structure is receptive to any kind of occurrence, except of the final one. The event which leads to a cohesive, one-dimensional existence and awaits nothing to come after it. The moment of Messianic revelation is the epitome of such an event, and as such is equivalent to death. After the Messiah reveals himself and redeems the world, there is one voice and nothing to wait for. There is no room for contingent occurrences once the absolute event has taken place. Derrida's Messianic structures desires no redemption, but its deferral. Derrida wishes to maintain the concept of experience of crisis, but he cannot tolerate the ultimate resolution of the crisis in the form of redemption. As long as the final redemption had not yet taken place, there is still room for human actions and agency. Contrary to previous versions of the story in which the main character yearns the arrival of the Redeemer, here the question, when will you come, is understood to be removing or deferring ad infinitum the absolute Messianic event. The Messiah must stay at the gates of Rome, and people should actively prevent him from passing through. Very Kafkaesque way. According to Derrida, the Levi desires not to hasten their redemption, but to affirm and maintain the margin between him and the Messiah. Derrida's reading should be understood as part of the grander discursive attempt to engage with philosophical and theological concepts without committing to the metaphysical categories usually associated with them. The Messiah's interlocutor turns to be a true agent of the deconstructive method. One of the prominent terms associated with Derrida's difference is spacing. The concept of spacing attests to the space or a difference between two things, but also functions as the element that interrupts the achievement of homogeneity or reduces the heterogeneous discourse into one privileged element. In Blanchot's Talmudic story, the one who speaks to the Messiah and asks when will you come, acts in the spirit of spacing. He points out the differences between himself and the Messiah. Derrida says this inadequation between now and now. And he protects the margin between them and makes sure contingent existence, that the contingent experience of crisis will not fall into a state of standstill in the fully redeemed world. So I will conclude by saying that I presented today three different interpretations of the Talmudic Messianic tale. Three attempts to revisit the notions of the Messianic experience of crisis and charge them with new meanings. Nevertheless, and I think it says something about what Scholem says about Messianic deferment, I believe that there is at least one aspect that ties the three interpretations together. Derrida, Rosenzweig, and Buber find in the tale resources for human activity and agency, they do not see themselves by any means a sentence to passivity and to complete deferment. Thanks.
Okay, very, very much. So that here we